Welcome to this afternoon's session. Chris Veers is leaving, so I'm going to leave my baseball cap on. No, Chris, you can leave. It's okay.
No, you take that hat off.
Wow, tough crowd. Wow, I've got conflicting advice here. Ron says yes, Chris says no. She used to be my boss, so I'm very careful, very careful. Jimmy and I used to work together. I'm not very careful around him. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thanks to the organizers. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Stephanie and staff. And to these guys for being on the panel. Thanks for staying. Don't fall asleep after lunch. I'd like to start with a pretty short story that kind of reminds me of where we are. When I look into a bear's eyes, I think I can tell if that bear is happy or not happy. And I think it gets at what we were talking about this morning in terms of my background. I grew up in the Adirondacks around black bears, would sit in a field watching families of black bears, moved on in my life to be a lifeguard, and then in this state park in the Adirondacks, and in high school and college, I was the one elected to have the black bears move out of campsites and camps. So, you know, kind of the bear whisperer, which was kind of weird. And then at one point, I had been rehabilitating a lot of animals, and a bear mom was poached. And so I ended up with the cubs of that mom. And I've always talked about the zen of animal management, knowing their natural history, their individual history. Their sensory systems are really important, their physical needs, physiological needs. And so I ended up with these bear cubs in my house at the time. That, you know, that's not a forest. But I raised them and eventually provided for their physical and physiological needs, their emotional needs, because they were cubs and they needed a mom, so I was their mom. And then they grew up, and, you know, bears grow claws and teeth and get very bearishly unruly. And they needed to go somewhere, and so they went into the bear habitat that we built for them in this this native species zoo that I was working on. And the last time I saw them, they were still being bears, and when I looked in their eyes, I could see that they were happy bears, they were thriving bears, and their well-being was amazing. And when I think about that, it reminds me that zoo was accredited for a while, is no longer accredited, but it reminds me that our accreditation programs for inputs in the United States get at all of that stuff. We have nutrition inputs, and we have veterinary inputs, and we have behavioral inputs, and we measure outputs as well. So so it gets at a lot of what we were talking about today, but it also gets at, you know, my background, that I really care about the happiness and well-being of those creatures. And I'm here on stage with 5 people who care as passionately as I do, and you all care as passionately about the happiness and well-being of the animals that you take care of. So I appreciate that, and I wanted to mention that. So we've got these fine gentlemen. I'll start with Dwight on the end. Dwight Lawson from Oklahoma City Zoo and Botanical Garden. Male and White, director of North Carolina Aquarium. David Field, professor and zoological director. Is that how you do it in Europe? Professor, doctor, or zoological director kind of thing?
It's only honorary anyway, so it doesn't matter.
ZSL. Mike Barclay, CEO of Wildlife Reserves of Singapore, and Mark Penning at Walt Disney Parks and Resorts. And we're charged with talking about accreditation, the role of media, and human-animal interactions in the zoo, or human aspects of welfare. And so they've each decided to take one of those aspects. We won't be here for 4 days, I promise. And each is going to talk for about 5 minutes, and then we'll take questions. So I think we'll just make it easy. And Mark, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and Thank you for all of you being here. It's been an amazing couple of days. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and sincerely hope we can do this on a more regular basis. I wanted to talk a little about telling our stories. We've heard a couple of times this week that we in this profession are not very good at telling our stories, at least not telling them effectively. And I'm with Disney, of course. Disney known to be a wonderful storytelling entity. What we've learned at our parks when it comes to telling stories about our animals is that we have a very important role to play as individual people. We have a team, Disney measures everything. We have a team of industrial engineers that look very carefully and thoughtfully at every move the guest makes, and we try and figure out ways to make the guest experience better. And what distinguishes an excellent experience for the guest with a good experience is very interesting. When the guest sees an animal in an engaging and complex natural habitat, an animal that appears to be healthy in the eyes of the guest and is doing natural behaviors, that's a good experience. What takes it to an excellent experience is when a person can interpret what's going on to them in an engaging and passionate way and share stories about that animal, the group of animals, what they're doing, where they come from, and what we're doing from a science perspective to learn about how to take better care of them and how to preserve their wild habitat so that there is a future for that species. At Disney, we take it a step further in actually getting cultural representatives from different parts of the world to stand there and interpret their behaviors, and also to share what those animals mean in their different cultures. So that holistic experience certainly makes for a very good story. Now, more broadly, we know that not enough of us in this profession are stepping up and taking a stand on some of these big, meaty issues out there. Some of us are doing it very well. I have to call out Jimmy Brahimi and his team at WCS for the Zoo series, which has done such an amazing job of demonstrating the amazing passion that the whole team has got for the well-being of those animals. And that's really what our guests want to see, that we care very passionately for those animals and look after them in a responsible fashion. So very well done to you. When we listened to the media panel earlier today, I really enjoyed that. I loved having the media folks here. I thought they did a great job. It was Roop, Lucy, Rachel, and there was one other, Karen, I think it was. You folks did a great job. Thank you very much. When we met at the Directors' Policy meeting in January, we were told by somebody from, I think, the Washington Post, that this profession lacks a compelling and overarching narrative. And I'm hoping that what you have gained out of this couple of days here with us is that we really do have a compelling narrative, that we are a very passionate and responsible group of people that are trying very hard to give our animals the very best care that we possibly can, to connect our guests with nature, and to preserve wild animals in wild places. And there is, for me, a very compelling narrative. So I do ask the folks from the media that were here to take the following thoughts into account. When we see shall we say, an unaccredited institution out there or an individual do something really silly and something bad happens, it really hurts all of us when we all get painted with that same brush. I know that my team would do much more amazing conservation work if we weren't stamping out fires every single day with some story that's about to break in the media. That's quite a challenge for us. Secondly, we've had real challenges with the media presenting things in a very simplistic way, and I'm hoping that what you've seen from this couple of days is these issues are very, very complex. You've seen that there are such differences in different regions of the world. We don't all agree on each element of what it is that we do. And I think that's quite important to keep in mind. It's just so complex that putting out a simplistic view doesn't help any of us. It just makes us look either stupid or look like we don't care enough to look into it in any detail. And then thirdly, I understand the media's desire to put forward a balanced story. But when you take that contrary viewpoint from somebody who has no credibility whatsoever and paint that as an equal argument, an equally weighted argument, I think it only diminishes the credibility of science in the public's eyes, and to me that's an extremely dangerous and slippery slope. So I would completely agree with the need to develop great relationships with our media partners and tell our great stories, but I hope that you were able to take some of that away as well and help us to tell our stories better.
Thanks. That's great. Yeah. Like the man said this morning, give it up for Mark Bennett. All right, Mike.
Thanks, Don. Don, as you know, I'm new to the zoo industry, and if I look at a bear and look it in the eye, I care if it's happy, but honestly, I don't know if it's happy. So I've got a few years to catch up on that. But, you know, yesterday, Carl Safino was sharing, if you're new to something, you can give an external perspective. And hopefully I can bring that to wildlife reserves and to our role at CSER and WASA. And one thing, honestly, I was quite shocked by. When I started, we're quite prominent with those organizations, but we have no accreditation, no requirement to commit to a level of standards. And in the other industries I've come from, that's the first base. So the good news is, as you heard from Dr. Lam, CSER is very serious about getting an accreditation or different language certification program off the ground. And we'll be doing everything we can to support that. But on our own, what we're trying to do is to learn and invite all the CSER members to come and get some accreditation audits from the other regional associations. So last year, AZA kindly did a pre-audit accreditation with us. We had ZAA, not ZAA, ZAA. Nick came down and did an audit, and that was a full audit. And this year it's going to be EASA. And so if Mafenwe is here, hopefully you won't be saying 44 countries, you'll be saying 45 countries by the end of the year. What's the purpose? The purpose is a joint learning experience. And honestly, when Nick and his team came down, it was like breathing fresh air into the organization. That affirmation of what we were doing well, that challenge about what we could do better, did a great deal to move us forward. And I think, you know, with each new audit, that will help. Now, I just want to touch on one thing. I thought until today, we've been very binary in our discussion about good zoo, bad zoo. And maybe that's very justified in the US, but it's much more complex in our part of the world. And can I just put you in the shoes of what a struggling zoo looks like in our part of the world? You're probably running a state zoo or a city zoo. You're probably a political appointee as a director with no background in the zoo business. You have very little money from the state to do your job, and you have no pricing power. You're forced to keep your ticket price at $2 or $3 so the average guy from the street can come to your zoo. And yet you're asked to take in every confiscated animal, every conflict animal, and you're right on the forefront of habitat loss. You're really in the trenches right where it's happening. My view is we should be helping these zoos. We shouldn't be excluding them. And we had some really nice discussions this morning about having partnerships with Southeast Asian zoos that want to get better. And perhaps that's something WASA can really grasp and take forward. In the 18 months I've been with our organization, I think we've 4 times sent groups of our staff down to Southeast Asian zoos to help. And we have invited several delegations to come and stay with us and learn what they can from us, and we can also learn from them. So I think this is something really fundamental, and if we're going to broaden the family and deal with some of these animal welfare issues. This is really rather critical. I won't add to your eloquent words on the media, because I think you have that really well covered. On the human dimension of welfare, I thought there's some great points made about the need to be very thoughtful about our recruitment, but then to make zookeeping a real profession. So give the training, the learning, the professional development, the opportunity to go overseas, work in conservation programs, opportunities to go to other zoos for promising staff. That all helps. But I just want to borrow Sally Sherwin's point about apply science-based management for positive welfare outcomes. We also feel there's a need to mix the science in there. And one example, our nutrition team proved to us that we were giving far too much sugary fruit to our primates. And now with much more vegetables in their diet, not only are they in better condition, their teeth in better condition, but they're playing more and they're more active. So we've mixed that with observation and science. So I think there's a lot we can do in that area.
That's great, thanks. And so his comments about different regions, different cultures, and different zoos dovetail really nicely with a conversation that we were having at lunch about ALPSA and some of the South American zoos and where they are in terms of their resources, their changes in management, and their ability to kind of move, if you will. Really interesting. David, you were also going to address some interesting accreditation forward actions.
Yes, thanks, Don. We do seem to have a bit of a dwindling audience. I hope that's not a recognition of the panel here, quality. But and I guess also we've got quality of audience rather than quantity. But I think it is interesting, though, that some the people that are offering challenges or criticisms of zoos, I have found through this conference that perhaps if they did make themselves slightly more aware of what was going on, a lot of the challenges and criticisms that are being set towards us, we are already far and away advanced of them. And I would suggest if people do want to challenge or critique, they should come and find out what we are actually doing, not just us being told to tell them. But one area that is probably a challenge that we touched on a couple of times, but not in any detail through the conference. So the word elephants has been mentioned a few times, and even the comment that elephants shouldn't be kept in zoos. And it was almost a throwaway remark and nothing more said. I firmly do not believe that. And I think what's happened in the UK recently in terms of advancing elephant care and future management to address legacy issues is a perfect example where statutory legislation, accreditation and zoo expertise have all been brought together to provide this advancement. We know there are problems with elephants in zoos. We know the way that we've been keeping them has not been correct in many areas. And there was a lot to learn, a lot of legacy issues. About 5 years ago, the UK government asked the British and Irish Zoo Association to formulate a group, a committee, an inclusive committee to discuss how we were going to go forward with elephant care. The British Zoo Association had already had guidelines of best practice out since the 1990s for elephants. Their second copy was also starting to have sort of evidence-based guidelines. But this committee that was established, say, 5 years ago, it was brought together by BIASA, but under the instruction of the UK government, has really, really advanced by setting incredible standards for elephant care, bringing together body scoring methodologies, behavioural monitoring methodologies, health requirements, etc. And they've also reviewed all the literature, the grey literature, the scientific literature, and we have now pulled together a series of standards which hopefully on Wednesday will be adopted by the government, so that whether you're a BIASA member or not, if you keep elephants, you have to take on these standards. The zoos and BIASA have been directly involved. I myself personally have been directly involved. So it is now going to become law. We will have dedicated elephant inspectors as part of our zoo inspections, reviewing those. They will then become adopted and expanded with examples of best practice, not just the standards for BIASA accreditation. And through my role as the tag chair of elephants for EASA, we will start bringing them in as best practice and eventually into the screening for EASA as well. So this really has brought together the very, very best that is out there for advancing elephant care. And within those standards, we are making it a requirement that you will have long-term management planning for your elephants. A 30-year plan is required, plus individual welfare plans. It will require you to be able to have the ability to undertake a whole range of health measures and be able to do blood testing, be able to do TB testing. It will endorse management systems, both free contact and protected contact. It will endorse and guide the use of ANCUS. We're not banning it, but we're showing how the practice should be used. And it also includes CPD for keepers and directors and governance of elephant teams. They're a comprehensive set of guidelines. And what pleases me is that the zoos were directly involved. The government recognised the expertise of the zoos to develop these, but the zoos were inclusive. And we had welfare bodies, scientists, and people who were opposed to elephants in zoos on that committee helping to formulate these standards. So I think it's a superb example of how practice can be put into legislation, put into accreditation, and provide one of the best advancements in elephant care that I can think of in recent times.
Thanks for that. And I'm just going to mention, for those of you who don't have elephants or aren't from the zoo community, the zoo community has been really, really active in Southeast Asia, working with, and I'm going to shout out to Africam Safari and Dr. Gerardo here. They've been really active in Southeast Asia with traditional mahouts, getting mahouts into protected contact systems with or without bullhooks, but protected contact systems which are more humane. So we provide veterinary care in range countries, we provide research dollars for range countries, and we provide husbandry expertise to range countries through programs like that by having elephants in Europe and in North America. So I also don't think it's a bad thing to have elephants. Malin, you don't even have many mammals. You've got a whole bunch of non-air breathers, well, water kind of oxygen breathers.
No elephants. No.
I'm an air breather, so I don't know anything about fish, but...
No, we're a small aquarium in rural North Carolina and northeastern coast. But listening to Professor Fraser's talk this morning reminded me of something that happened a long time ago. It stuck with me. At the place where I was working, we had river otters, and a geriatric otter had died. And the keeper staff were very grief-stricken by this process, and so I felt compelled to talk to them, and we worked through the grieving process. And later, a fish aquarist came up to me and said, "You know, when our fish die, we grieve too." And I realized that the staff-animal connection runs throughout our aquarium. It's not just the big stars that get the attention. And I think that kind of dedication was exemplified a year ago in North Carolina. We had a sudden onset of cold weather, which for sea turtles can be a problem. If the water temperature drops too faster than they can migrate south, then they're called, we call it cold stunning, but they're stunned. They can't move. They eventually suffer a slow death. And so our sea turtle hospital was the only area, or the only place in our area that we can receive these animals and give them veterinary care and hopefully bring them back to a condition we can release them back into the wild. The thing is, our aquarium hospital has a capacity of about 30 sea turtles. And we had a record cold stunning event last year. Over 2,000 sea turtles stranded along North Carolina's coast. In the first 2 days, we went from a capacity of 30 to 350 sea turtles. And staff from all over the aquarium came in, worked overtime. Everybody pulled together. We worked with our partners, community, to triage the animals, get them the care, immediate care. And then, of course, we had a lot of turtles, and more were coming in. And so that's where being part of the AZA network really helped out. We called out to our sister aquariums and other AZA accredited aquariums. We were able to get those animals out so that they could get secondary care if they needed it and eventually return to the wild. But I just think that without the aquarium and its staff, there wouldn't have been anybody there to receive these animals, give them primary care. And without the AZA network, there wouldn't have been anybody there to give the animals the secondary care and ultimate return to the wild that was needed.
Well, thanks. And Dwight, you're special. You're best known as a herpetologist and now as a zoo director. But can you give us a kind of a herp perspective on all of this?
Sure, and as a, I guess, last-minute addition to the panel, let's kind of just make a few comments about accreditation from that basis. Herpetology is my academic background and kind of my personal passion. So, in looking at that, thinking about the discussions...
Is that mic breaking up?
Yep. Just part of being special. So yeah, just a couple things based on our conversations over the last couple of days, and I'm also a member of AZA's Accreditation Commission. But looking at it from a HERP perspective, obviously our standards, both how they're developed and more importantly how they're applied, and then again the broader discussions that we've been having in the last couple of days about welfare. From my perspective, they're all heavily biased by, from, and for large mammals, and I would argue that we need a broader taxonomic perspective as we talk about welfare and look at standards and assessments and audits and things like that. Because it just appears that we don't value life equally, and it kind of struck me. I really enjoyed Carl's talk yesterday, and then when the picture came up towards the end of his talk where he was working and he had the parrot on his shoulder, I was like, how would everybody react if that was a spider monkey or something? I mean, I think the gasp in the audience would have been audible. And you see those discrepancies in the standards. I think particularly about ambassador animals or education animals that we have and how detailed we look at certain things versus others and what's okay to do to a turtle or versus a porcupine or whatever. I think a lot of the discussions that are happening around accreditation from the aquarium community, I mean, talking about fish and some of the specific logistic issues and how you apply standards to everything from schools of fish to elephants has been really fascinating. And I think in between those two camps within accreditation, there's a whole taxonomic breadth that we really need to tackle and look at. How you do that logistically, I mean, now if you have elephants in AZA, you get an elephant inspector when you're up. If you have significant aquarium facilities, you get somebody with that background that comes. If you got a bunch of snakes and turtles, they're not necessarily sending a snake or turtle person out there, but I think some of the discussion about how different regional associations are approaching it and self-audits or whatever, there's a lot of tactics in there that I think would benefit a lot of different animals if we continue sharing these ideas and trying to implement them. And on a somewhat of a side note, not just accreditation standards, but if you think about the kind of the common ground boxes that we talked about yesterday, good for the individual, good for the species, there's a lot of really low-hanging fruit that I don't know that we're coordinating as a community around. If you think about some of the big issues right now, pangolins, the Asian turtle crisis, which has been going on for 25 years, a very seasonal topic right now, rattlesnake roundups here in the U.S. I mean, these are humane crises, they're conservation crises, and if we were to take half the energy in this room for an afternoon, I think we could make a huge impact just tackling one of those things and divvying up who's going to do what. Maybe a little off topic. But anyway, I think just to touch from accreditation to kind of PR and the human aspect, obviously research, training, finding the right people to do this, that gets tougher and tougher as you get more and more species, but it also gets more and more important. And so, we need to find those right people that can look into a bear's eyes or a turtle's eyes or something like that and tell you whether or not it's doing okay. But the PR sales pitch on the herp front's a little harder than some of the other cases.
Can I just ask a follow-up question to that, though? Do you think that herps are kind of proportionately more used than all the other taxa for ambassador animals?
Yeah, it's probably a fair assessment. I don't have any numbers to base that on, but certainly, I think people think they're easy to do, and so there certainly is a lot of them. And it's interesting in the Accreditation Commission, as you know, having done it for years, you'll see, we see pictures of the institution as these cases come up, and there's always here are the education animals, and I'll look at that and go, that turtle's not in the right spot or something or the thing, and it's not even a problem that somebody's pointing out, and so I just don't know that we're looking at that through the right lens sometimes.
So a reminder, you can be filling out cards. Looks like almost everybody's asleep. I'd like to thank Rich or Peggy for putting the animals there. It feels like a bigger crowd now, so thanks. I would like to go back to my black bears for a second. They are ambassador animals, and the zoo is not apologetic about that. They do help to tell the story of how to get along with bears out in the wild, out in nature, just like turtles can tell that story, or maybe birds do, or elephants do. But I wanted to make the point about these bears, about some of the turtles, about some of the snakes, and that is sitting through these 3 days, it's occurred to me before, but harder now, we really don't tell that story about rescues. And rescues, I guess, would be you go out and you take that away from somebody. Zoos are given these animals by government agencies, whether they're in this region or another region. So, I consider the 2 black bears rescues. I counted up the animals at Oregon Zoo out of 1,800 animals and 6,000 butterflies, thank you very much, native caterpillars that we release every year. But out of those 1,800, 60 megavertebrates are rescues, 60. And so black bears and mountain lions, and we placed more than 100 mountain lions with using our Oregon Zookeeper with all the zoos in North America, and bobcats and bald eagles, and we do the veterinary care on bald eagles, and if they can go back, they go back, and if they can't, then we keep them or they go somewhere else. So we need to tell that story, right? And I have 10% of the world population of California condors. Not one person in Portland knows that until I tell them that. 10% of the world population of California condors, because they can only see 4 in the zoo, and the rest are in, an off exhibit habitat breeding. So huge stories to tell. Gentlemen, I'd like to ask a general question, seeing no cards from a sleepy audience. How do we ideally schedule? Thank you so much, Stephanie. Wow. Somebody was really busy. Can you see that? Wow. We need a close-up of the crossouts. It's very, very nice. I'll ask this question. If accredited zoos suffer from being lumped in with the unaccredited or roadside zoos, what can animal protection organizations do to engage more accredited zoos in the mutual goal of eliminating the suffering of animals in roadside menageries? Anybody want to try to take that?
So that's a fantastic question. We need to be fairly careful about that, because if we as zoos go in and try to shut down an entity, we get accused of trying to get animals from them, which is generally not the case, or we're trying to eliminate competition. So if we drive something like that, it's actually quite awkward for us. What's a whole lot better is if another agency or entity is doing it but is using us to provide expertise in handling, triage, making some decisions, and rehoming those animals. So I hope that makes sense. But yes, there's a huge role for us to play in that sense.
Other thoughts, Dwight?
I just chime in. It's another opportunity on the public advocacy perspective for common ground and to highlight the differences. It's not how you should care for that big cat or whatever, even if we're not doing it as well as everybody would like. That's certainly not acceptable, and I don't know that you need to go through all the hoops to shut somebody down, but you can certainly lend your voice to that argument.
I'll also say, as somebody who's worked for a variety of government-owned zoos, that elected government officials are very, very sensitive to the different businesses in their area, right? So if you're an accredited zoo and they own you, and you say, well, we should helped to close that roadside zoo over there down, and that guy happens to be friends with the elected official or can show a business case for staying open no matter how bad his facilities are, as long as they meet the minimum criteria set by USDA Animal Welfare Act regulations, we kind of don't have as much standing with the government official who's giving us tax dollars as the guy who's giving the government tax dollars for his operations, if that makes sense. But I've found that to be kind of a sticky wicket as well. Other countries?
Well, I guess, I mean, it's interesting. In the UK recently, we've had an organisation which is quite a major zoo, a failing zoo due to an individual. And I think perhaps I wish my organisation had spoken out I wish we'd spoken out vocally, because it was an awful zoo. Instead, what we did was to work behind the scenes with the local council, promising that we would go in to help just as soon as they were ready to close it down. So I think perhaps a better understanding, working with the animal protection organisations, that we may not be very vocal about closing down some of these organisations, but we are there to help and to support with technical expertise. Not necessarily always space, but with technical expertise, which may include euthanizing some of the animals and helping to move some of the animals around, or even running it for a while. We offered to run that zoo for a while, the one that I spoke about. But it's recognition of that and partnerships with animal protection organisations if they are looking to close down areas.
So, I mean, I think in Southeast Asia, the problems we face are just enormous. But one example, in Indonesia, there are a huge number of elephants in captivity because they've been conflict elephants. And there's a nature park right in the south of Sumatra called Wakambas. And if you go to the government facility there, there's about 50 elephants, chained most of the day, doing very little. It's a really very depressing sight. The good news is about 20 elephants have been taken from this facility and are being funded to be put into elephant patrol units along the edge of the Wakambas Park, and to drive a wedge between the wild elephants in the park and the farming communities. And the farming communities love it because they're getting less elephants marauding through their crops, and the price for land's gone up, their crop yield has gone up. So now they're alerting the patrols when they're seeing the wild elephants. They're not shooting or poisoning anymore. They're getting the patrols in. And the wild elephant population is recovering quite well within the park. So it's a small example, but you know this is all over Southeast Asia right now. So any other good ideas, keep them coming.
I will say also this goes back to telling our story. So sometimes we don't tell our story well. Sometimes we're not allowed to tell our story. So Oregon Zoo and Oregon Coast Aquarium helped to close down a zoo/pet store in Portland, hundreds of animals. But because they were being legally seized, we were not allowed to tell our story, right? So it had to go through the folks that were seizing those animals, and they could tell the story the way that they needed to. The other thing that I'll share is I know of a major zoo that will remain unnamed, that's working in a country that will also remain unnamed, and is working on major poaching activities for a critically endangered charismatic megavertebrate, which is also going to remain unnamed. And the reason that I'm not naming any of the three of those things is because if any one of those was known, then the activity might be traced from the person who's turning in the poachers back to that zoo. And as those people are working in that country, they would fear for their lives, and they already are scared. And so I know about the program. Several of us in the room know about that program. And they've saved a lot of these beautiful, charismatic megavertebrates. Thank you. And they can't tell their story. And they won't. They're just going to keep putting money into the ranger patrols. They're going to keep getting the information and giving it to the appropriate authorities and keep seeing the poachers and the traders arrested. And that satisfies us. But we can't tell that story openly for fear of loss of life. Just how it is. Looks like we've got 2 minutes and no cards yet. Closing comments?
Can I come back on the media piece? Because
Yes.
I thought the panel might follow that through. But I agree. I thought it was a great session this morning. And actually, I thought there were some really good messages for all us zoos in that, about the need to be much more proactive in our sharing, to be open to the media in good times, not just bad times, and to avoid that temptation which we fall into of giving out too many easy, superficial stories, but not allowing the journalist to research a proper, in-depth story. And also, personally, do I know my beat journalists well enough? No, I don't. And that's one of my take-home duties for next week, to begin calling them and getting to know them better.
Thanks, David.
And if I could just follow up on that as well, I mean, I did enjoy that session. It was very, very useful. Don't necessarily recognise in the UK, we have got really, really good relationships with media. Challenging at times, but it's healthy relationships that's there. But I think the one comment I think was made is that I'm incredibly proud of my communications team, and I think having a good and highly professional communication team actually facilitates better media contact rather than putting up the barriers between them. So a really highly trained comms team plus good media training for all your staff really helps to get the messages across. And just one final point, media is just one part of our communication strategy of getting stories over. It's certainly not the only one.
Melanie?
I just want to say that I'm really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm going to take a lot of things back to me, back to the aquarium, and also to AZA.
Dwight, Mark, either?
Well, just I'll echo that, but also on the PR piece, I think the one little snippet that didn't come out this morning, was just that I'm horrible with names, but I think it was Lucy who was here and now in Philadelphia. She ran through the list of places that she had been, and in talking with our local media folks and trying to do that and establish those relationships and keep things fresh, just be aware that those local media markets are like that. And as soon as you get to know somebody, they're gone and off to a bigger one, and somebody else is in. And so, that is a nonstop process to keep in touch with them.
That's right. Mark, final comments?
So final thoughts. We, as Disney, just contributed towards a report that has just been published in Nature of Americans, the Nature of Americans report by Case and Associates. And one of the amazing conclusions was that 65% of parents surveyed said it is a serious problem that their kids are not spending more time outdoors with nature, with animals. They were as concerned about that as they were about the quality of education in this country. That's how important they saw it. So that gives us a huge opportunity to be the outdoors and to be the animal contact that these folks are desperately looking for, and to help guide them into spending more time out in nature.
Thanks. And I guess my final comment is, I would just encourage everybody who's in a leadership position to support your staff in professional development in either media and outreach or animal welfare and animal welfare science and art, or both, preferably both. All right, thanks everybody for being here. Give it up for these guys.